We're actually not totally done with this user info component yet. Okay, destructure props in avatar and user info. That was the last thing I did. If you look at the CSS for user info, we didn't do these two, right? And those are for the sign out button. And one of them has a hover, which we said was a problem when you do CSS in JavaScript. So we're going to have to deal with that. And I want to deal with it by making another component just to... This thing does enough that I'm going to go ahead and pull that out. So I'll make a new component called signout.js, capitalized, of course. We'll import React from React. Const signout equals arrow function. Export default signout. And it's been complaining that this is a link, and it says maybe it should be a button. And that actually, for sign out, probably makes more sense anyway. So I think I will actually do what it suggests there, and I will make this a button instead. But instead of just putting the word sign out in there, I'll put this font awesome thing. So if I import sign out from /sign out, and I just replace all this with sign out, nothing was returned from render. I forgot my return statement. Thankfully, it's a good error message that tells me it usually means a return statement is missing. Simple enough. There we go. Ugly button, but it's a button. So let's see if we can apply the CSS that was already there. But we've got some complications here because we've got this hover thing. So I mentioned there's more than one way to do CSS in JavaScript. And we're going to have to use one of the other ways. So the way we're doing it now is with inline styles. We use the style prop, and we just pass a JavaScript object in there. And when it actually ends up on the page, if we just look at one of these things, you just end up with an actual style property or a style attribute on the thing. So they're totally inline styles. And you can't do things like hover in an inline style, because hover is actually another selector. It's a pseudo class. So we're going to have to do it using an actual style sheet, ultimately. So there are ways to do this while still doing your CSS in JavaScript. There are a bunch of links on this. I think they're on yesterday's notes, probably, about CSS and JavaScript. So you can always look at that. But one of the things is a package called Aphrodite, framework agnostic CSS in JavaScript, with support for server-side rendering, browser prefixing, and minimum CSS generation. Works great with and without React. Supports media queries. For responsive design, to have different styles applied depending on the width of the screen. Supports pseudo selectors like hover and active, and we need hover right now. So this is going to fix some of our problems. So even if you're not following along right now, you need to do this part in your project, not just copy it from mine. We need to add Aphrodite. So to do that, to add a new package, a new dependency after you've already created the app, we type yarn add Aphrodite. I will paste that in Slack. Yeah. And that command does two things. First, it downloads Aphrodite and sticks it inside node modules. So now we have it available. But it also adds it to package.json. So now Aphrodite is listed there. So remember, our node modules folder is not actually committed to the repository, but package.json is, which lists our dependencies. So that yarn add command also adds it to the list here. And you'll see the npm command is right there in the README. Here's a link to Aphrodite on GitHub. And it has some explanations of how to use it, as well as some videos, apparently. One thing I see is that I have two things to import now, style sheet and CSS from Aphrodite. So I will, so that's the part you need to follow along with now. You need to actually download the thing and add it to your package.json. So my sign out component is going to use that. So I will import it at the top. So I'm importing style sheet and CSS. So the style sheet dependency, what I do with that is when I create my styles object, const styles, it's no longer just an object. I now have to call stylesheet.create and pass an object in there. So I basically just wrap the object I was making anyway with stylesheet.create. And then I just kind of make it the way I did before. I'm going to put some extra styles in there because now it's a button, it was a link, so I need to like get rid of the border and stuff it wants to put in by default. So here's what I'm doing. And then spoiler alert for that next part. So here's the basic style I want for that button. But now I can do things like hover. And to do that, inside the rule that's already going to impact that element, add a property, a key, with the name of that pseudo selector you're using. So the string :hover. So I have to use quotes around that, right? Because that's not, I couldn't just put :hover:, because that colon it'll think that's some kind of operator. So I have to put the string :hover, and then the style that I want, which is simply color white. And the way Aphrodite works when you do the stylesheet.create is it creates an actual CSS class for this and puts it in the head of the document. So it actually puts a style tag in the head. It creates a real CSS rule with all this stuff and auto-generates a class name that's guaranteed to be unique. So instead of using an inline style with the style prop, we actually use class name. So on the button, I will put class name equals, and then not a string, because we don't know what that auto-generated class name is going to be. That's what this CSS import is for from Aphrodite. So we say CSS, that's a function. That's a function that we're importing, and we pass in styles.button, whichever style we want. Styles.button. If we were using inline styles, we would just say style equals curly braces styles.button. But what we're saying here is I want the class name to be whatever class name is auto-generated from that rule. And that's what that CSS helper function does. It tells you which actual CSS class got created from that rule. Because when we do stylesheet.create, it actually creates a style sheet with a real CSS class. And by calling CSS and passing that style name in, we get the actual class name back. So let's see if this works. By the way, sometimes when you do yarn add, you have to restart your server for it to get the new dependency. Looks like I didn't have to in this case. And now my hover thing works. See that? So if I inspect this thing, let's look at the actual button. Now instead of inline styles, I've got a class here. And that's not a class name that we chose, but it's got all those rules there. And if I look, it actually has the one for hover as well. So it actually added real style sheet stuff up in the head for that. So that's why we can do things with this CSS that we can't do using inline styles. So I'm going to use Aphrodite just in those components where it's necessary, because I'm using a pseudo selector or something like that. You could use it for everything, and maybe it would be better to use it all the time or never. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to just use it on those where it's necessary. So questions about that? Yeah.
Outside of being able to use pseudo classes, is there any advantage to using Aphrodite without pseudo classes?
Responsive design is another thing. Yeah, pseudo selectors and responsive design, stuff like that. Media queries. That is things that say, if the screen is wider than this, these rules apply. If the screen's wider than this, these rules apply. So that's a common thing. You'll sometimes see as you make things narrower, the whole page actually changes layout. Primary purpose for that is so you can have a different layout for mobile, but you can also just do it on other screens. You can't do that with inline styles either. You have to have a real CSS for that. So anything that you can't do in inline styles, you'd have to do something like this. Other than that, I mean, the purity of using actual CSS instead of inline styles, some people just think inline styles are gross. I don't think it matters that much when you're doing React, but yeah. So you can do more with it. And like I said, there are very opinionated blog posts about all this stuff. And I sent you a link to this thing. It's got a lot more info about how you do certain things. So that's Aphrodite briefly. Let's add Aphrodite, and how about I do this? I'm going to actually commit package.json and yarn.lock separately, so I can just have a commit that says add Aphrodite. And then I'll commit these, add sign out component.